All right, we're going to start back up. We have Brandon O'Hara. He's going to be talking about build tools, unfortunately.
That was a very warm and welcoming message. Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about build tools, unfortunately, apparently. My name's Brandon. I'm from Montana. I've been a web developer for about 10 years now. I've been using Expression Engine since about 2011, 2012. So I've been able to come to a couple of these, and they've always been great. So thank you guys for stopping in and letting me talk for you guys. Like it says up there, and it has to be true, I'm a pretty chill guy. So it's facts. All right. Build tools. How many of you guys utilize Grunt, Gulp, Webpack, anything like that? How many of you guys use Grunt or Gulp out of those people? Great. And how about Webpack? A couple of people. Great. So yeah, the Webpack's typically a little bit scary. It's hard to get into a little bit, but typically what these things do, and you guys are aware, there's a couple of hands that weren't raised, so I'll go over it a little bit, of what these things should do. And at the end of the day, these things should make your life easier. If they're not making your life easier, why are we using them? Sometimes there's a little bit of headache getting set up and started, but at the end of the day, these should be removing your repetitive work and compiling your Sass and less, and if you use Compass, utilizing ECMAScript 2015 Javascript, which we should all be using at this point because JavaScript used to suck and it's kind of all right now. It's getting there. It's almost like a programming language at this point. We have, some classes. There's also some angry front-end developers right now, but we have synchronized environments so that everyone on your team is all using, the same process of how to get everything minified and stuff. But at the end of the day, like I said, it should make your life easier. So Grunt and Gulp are task runners, and there's kind of two differentiations of build tools. Task runners, typically, they just take a single task, they run it, and when the task's done, the next task starts. But the tasks don't necessarily ever talk to each other. And a lot of people are kind of confused on why would you ever want them to talk to each other? And we'll go over that a little bit with Webpack. But the great thing about Grunt and Gulp is that there's an easy entrance to it. It's pretty easy to find a configuration file and get all set up and start moving that way. So here's an example configuration file. It's not mine, so I just stole it from the internet. But you can see here we pull in Gulp, you add some plugins, and you go task by task. And you see that they're just 1, 2, 3. You run them, and you're all compiled. Webpack's a little bit different. Webpack, you have an entry point, just one single point of truth, and then you pull everything into that one single file, and you try and export it. Everything gets exported out into the proper, distribution folders and stuff like that. But usually everything's just scaffolded, and we're going to bundle everything into one single source of truth there. The problem with Webpack, and there's also some people that are mad, I'm sure, that I excluded Browserify. You can deal with it, because it sucks. So there it is down in the corner where it should be. The problem with Webpack a little bit is you see this configuration file and people immediately jump to it and they say, I'm out. That's too much. Regular expressions. Everyone I'm sure here has constantly Googled regular expressions or how to actually learn the syntax. I've learned regular expressions probably 1,000 times. You go and you're like, this is going to be it. I'm going to remember it, and it's gone. So it's a little bit daunting when you come in here. All right, so which tool's best? I don't know. if you guys haven't got where I'm going with this here. But you guys remember the Netflix movie, the Bandersnatch movie, where you pick the different entry points? So now everyone's going to raise their hands and see which way we want to go. That's a lie. We're just going to do it on Webpack. But there isn't a one-size-fits-all tool. Gulp and Grunt are perfectly great. They've worked for a long time, and they can continue to work great. There's strengths and weaknesses to all of these. So don't listen to some guy at a podium to tell you that there's only one solution, because there isn't. You always want to be wary of people starting a new, there's a new trendy new thing, and everyone has to use it. However, that being said, you should use Webpack and jump ship here a little bit. And this is what I'm going to kind of explain to you and why it's not that bad. And once you get all set up and started, it's not that bad. First off, you're going to have to learn one of these anyways. So we're just going to, might as well just do the one that's a little bit more difficult. But more importantly, once you learn the basics, it's going to save you a whole bunch of time. And overall, your life's going to be a lot easier. All right, so moving into package management. How many of you guys utilize like NPM? And then the back-end developers, Composer, is pretty similar, except NPM is garbage, and it never quite works the way that it's supposed to. Composer seems to work a little bit better, but NPM's kind of a little bit of a dumpster fire. So there it is. One thing about NPM, I don't know if you guys remember, a couple of years ago there was, when you install your JSON or your package.json and you look in your scary node modules folder and there's 8 billion packages that are pulled in and you just pulled in one package. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago when somebody, it was kind of a rudimentary package. They took it and they injected a Bitcoin miner so that once they pushed an update, people were injecting a Bitcoin miner on everyone's computer, and nobody noticed because there's 8 million packages. So that still could happen, and everyone just forgot about that, but we'll just ignore that. The other thing we have is Yarn. If you guys do use NPM, please start using Yarn. It's installable via NPM, ironically. But it pulls things down in threads rather than one by one. So it's going to be a lot faster, as well as you can work offline, which is great if you had pulled in the packages previously. All right, so the configuration file here, how many of you guys have ever utilized like NPM scripts or know what that is at all? A couple of people here. If you haven't and you're running something all the time, even if you aren't using Webpack or anything like that, you should utilize these because the compiling Sass, or if you have a watcher or something like that, can get remembering all of that or just typing it out. We want to save our precious finger bones and joints, because we're all going to have arthritis here in 20 years. So we want to limit the amount of keystrokes that we have as much as possible. So utilize these scripts that you just run npm run dev on that, for example, and run Webpack without having to set modes and anything like that. For example, the npm run watch, and that'll sit and it'll watch all your files as you're making changes and stuff, and we'll go over that in just a little bit. All right, the dreaded, we're going to get into the configuration file. So I did put my slides up on the EE Slack thing, because we're going to get into a little bit of code up here, and even though I had the font size at about 8 million on my computer while I took these the screenshots, they're a little bit difficult to read even still. So there's 4 main components of Webpack files, and if you can learn the first 3 and then plugins, you just copy and paste stuff. But an entry point in Webpack is a little bit different than Gulp and Grunt. If you guys were familiar, before we started bundling things, you'd look at the bottom of an HTML page and there would be 20 different JavaScript dependencies. You're pulling in jQuery, and then you're pulling in, and they have to be in a specific order. any more in modern JavaScript development. We have an entry point, and we're going to acquire all our dependencies in the JavaScript, pull it all in, and spit it out into an output here. So typically, you have a source, and then you have a distribution folder. The output's usually that distribution folder. We have rules. The other thing with Webpack is you're pulling in a whole bunch of files. You're pulling in images and fonts, and CSS and Sass. Rules essentially let Webpack know what to do when it gets to those files. So we're going to set some regular expressions in there to catch whatever files we want, and then we can compile it and let it know what to do there. All right. Essentially, we're just returning a JavaScript object. You configure Webpack with just a webpack.config.js file. You'll see that there's a whole bunch of boilerplates that you can get started with, but here you can see the basic, kind of the basic entry into it. We include Webpack and an absolute path helper. We're going to start with 2 entry points. We have our JavaScript and we have a Sass file here. We're going to spit those out into a folder called dist, and we're going to name that JavaScript bundle.js. So it's pretty simple here that we have, we have a file, we include everything within that file, and we're going to spit it out into another folder. All right, so the entry parameter. We see that we have 2 files there. We have our JavaScript, we have our Sass. We can also do this kind of hacky thing, and you can include your Sass within your JavaScript and have 1 entry point. If you like, being a monster, I think that's fine. I think they should be a little bit different. Output, as I explained, we have a distribution folder. We should never touch or minimize any of our source files because we want to go back and actually edit them later. So we're just setting an absolute path here. I know it's a little bit daunting, or we see that resolve the dir name. Webpack likes absolute files, so regardless of what system we're on, we're always going to have an actual direct path. So it's going to be that user/username code, your code directory, or on Ubuntu and stuff like that, just the more standardized versions. All right, and the other thing about Webpack is Webpack doesn't know how to do anything other than JavaScript out of the box. So we're also bundling all of these images and font files, Sass and stuff like that. So we have kind of rules, or what Webpack calls loaders. And with loaders, that's essentially going to tell Webpack how to get it into Webpack's, their API and stand it up inside there. So this is where people typically start to zone out and jump ship here because we have some regular expressions and things get a little bit confusing within here. But we have loaders within the rules. You'll see we have 2 here. One with that regular expression, if you guys read that at all, you can see .js, and the other one's a .sass or Sass or the SCSS. So we have options there, and then we see we have a couple of loaders within that. There's 1,000 different versions of syntax as well with Webpack. You can pass it arrays of objects, you can pass it just a single object, you can pass strings as an object, so it gets a little confusing to begin with there, but if you stick with me, we'll be able to figure that out. Within that JavaScript one, we'll see that we're going to use Babel and compile, our good JavaScript. And then, there's a couple of other loaders to compile the Sass and CSS within that second rule. Within this first rule, like I said, that test, we're going to match any JavaScript files that we include inside that index.js. We're going to exclude anything that's pulled in from node modules because it should be good when it's in there. That's not necessarily true, but for the most part, we want to trust that the people that we're pulling in, that their code's minified and versioned to ECMAScript and should be working with our other stuff. But then the loader that we're going to be using is Babel, and that's going to compile it out into bad JavaScript. With you guys remember prototype and all of that garbage. I just saw people just die a little bit inside when I said that. That's another thing that should die in a fire. But that's not going anywhere. Babel. This is one of those things where Webpack, Google's going to be your best friend. Every single one of these loaders, you're going to say Webpack, Sass. You're going to take the first link, and they're going to tell you to stick stuff in here. So for Babel, for example, we want to make sure that we're compiling it to, I think it's this default set is we're only going to accept browsers that are above 1% usage, which I think for a while there, Internet Explorer 8 was hanging on since Windows XP was so widely used. So how many of you guys, does anyone still support Internet Explorer 8? Not by choice? Yeah, that's unfortunate. I feel very badly for you. The second rule here, we're catching all of our Sass files that are injected in, and we're going to load a couple of loaders here. The Sass loader, we're going to convert it to CSS. The CSS loader converts it into a Webpack module, and then we're going to extract it out into its own file. Webpack it does have this cool thing, or this cool loader where you don't have to extract it out into its own CSS file. You can inject it directly into the DOM, which is kind of interesting. So you wouldn't even include your style sheet. It's just on every page load, whatever styles that you want it to be injected, it'll just inject it right into the DOM. So that's kind of neat, but for the most part, you just extract it out. All right, and then the plugins parameters. It's kind of the catch-all of after everything runs. These are things that when you're on the documentation page, you're just going to copy and paste some stuff. For example, this mini CSS, we're just going to give it the file name that we want to export it out to. The purge CSS we'll go over a little bit later, but we're just essentially setting configurations and kind of last-minute things to do after everything's been installed and bundled into Webpack's API. All right. So these are some of the cool things we can do with Webpack, and you've seen this with Grunt and Gulp as well, but like file minification. If you guys aren't minifying files, it sucks for the end user because that's, it's a lot of the times like 50 kilobytes. That doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're on, I live in Montana, so if I'm not on Wi-Fi, there's scrolling, it's not good. So definitely minify your files here. As well as, like I said, if you're not using JavaScript, the new versions of JavaScript, why? And you should really be using it because you can have classes and arrow functions and everything, all of the new little goodies and things that make JavaScript not as terrible. You get to use that, and you can compile those down, and it's going to work on those old browsers as well. Dependency file generation is great. So within Sass, for example, everyone in the world uses Font Awesome for their icon set. But you can just load in a single line that says pull in Font Awesome. It's going to go and extract those files and move them over into a fonts directory for you as well. So it's really nice to not have to, or be up to date when you pull stuff as well. Weird animation in the middle there. How many of you guys have ever used like tree shaking or purge CSS? Do you guys ever use that? Resounding no. You should. It's kind of a cool process where you say, here are all my templates. Here's my CSS. Go and find in all the templates, all the classes, all of the IDs, all of the things like that. And if we can't match those against it, we're going to strip it out of your CSS. For example, in our workshop 2 days ago, we had a pretty simple application. We pulled in Bootstrap. And of course, we didn't need anything really from Bootstrap other than a nav bar, as you typically do, your nav bar and grid. But then you get the burden of all of that other components. But we went from 149 kilobytes to 17 kilobytes after removing all of that CSS. So it's definitely something to start thinking about. Start utilizing. I know that there's some dynamic, IDs are generated by, IDs or indexes, and in a lot of the case with expression engine like slugs and things like that. So sometimes it's not always the best, but you can also exclude or hard code things to stay within that. Also, you can optimize images. If you guys aren't aware, or if you've ever had a designer they slice out the images. A lot of the times they like to save them as 300, instead of the 72. Whereas, the JPEGs for, or a gradient or something like that that's just in the background, you can take that quality and dip it down quite a bit, and that's not going to be a problem, and nobody's ever going to see that a lot of the time. And one of my favorite things within this is browser sync. How many of you guys have ever used browser sync? That's good. Browser sync's great. So it's essentially live injecting of CSS in your JavaScript into a template. So in the workshop, it was hard because we have a single monitor, but at home, a lot of the times we have our multiple monitors. We can have the website up in one other one. A lot of the times you can even have a third, and you can have a phone size. And as you're making changes in CSS, it's going to inject all of that stuff in without having to go over, get on the page, hit refresh. So it's going to save you a whole bunch of time. And you can see with this animated GIF here that it's as you're making changes, we can go in and inject all of that stuff. All right, so there's quite a few Webpack configuration generators. So a lot of the work you don't even have to entirely do yourself. You can go in and say, for this create app, let's see if we can open this up here. So this is a pretty cool, let me zoom in. Pretty cool thing. You can say, hey, I'm using Vue, CSS, Sass, or less. And it's going to come over and kind of make a Webpack configuration file for you. So a lot of the times you don't have to know or remember the syntax entirely. However, I have found that there's some specific things that don't always work out of the box with these. So it is great to know the rules, but just know that for the most part, you can get into this without having to know most about the config file. You might have to tinker with a couple of little things, but for the most part, you can optimize and do your CSS and linting and stuff without having to really worry about it too much. As well as, there's a whole bunch of boilerplate, the standardized things you can save into a snippet and have that inject, when you create a new project or anything like that as well. And then probably what I think is the most exciting thing that really got me into Webpack was Laravel Mix. And this doesn't necessarily work with everyone, as we found out at my workshop last year. It blew up some Windows machines essentially. So you have to configure it a little bit more and get things to get running. But it's essentially a wrapper around Webpack that's going to make your life so much easier. So you don't have to remember the syntax of all of the Webpack. It's going to essentially have this API that looks something like this, rather than the configuration file. Essentially, you just say, I have a JavaScript file. I want it spit out into a bundle. I have a Sass file. I want it spit out into a bundle. Copy some index. Copy, an MP3 or anything like that. You can set the base directory so that all of these are just generated automatically into the distribution folder, as well as you can configure browser sync the same way that you typically would within that. This also allows you to add hard-coded rules or anything like that, to where if you wanted to merge, this general type of thing and you wanted some specific fine-tuning, you can write some of your own rules or include some of your own plugins. Out of the box, this doesn't have a couple of things like the image optimization or the tree shaking, but those are things that you can pull in and configure yourself if you really wanted to fine-tune. But this will get you 90% of the way within 5 minutes. So this is definitely worth taking a look at. All right, that's kind of my sales pitch right here of Webpack. Do you guys have any questions or anything like that?
Why did you say Browserify sucks?
Browserify? Because I spent 2 weeks trying to get it set up and I never got it to work. essentially. So just me not liking it, I don't know. I did include the repo within this link to the workshop that we did, and you can go and see the actual steps of how I would set up and configure Webpack. I go step by step of this is how I would compile JavaScript. This is how I would include the Sass and do that. So you can go to this repo, look at the commits. There's some ones from early on, so ignore those because I'm just an idiot when I type sometimes, so had to be changes last minute. But you can see those commits and kind of walk through how I would configure my Webpack and stand that up. Any other questions? Yeah.
So our team's kind of newish at Git repositories and Gulp and that kind of stuff. Do you typically commit the configuration files for the automation tool, whether it's Webpack?
Yeah, I typically do, and that's just so everyone's working on within the same environment. So you can have one person set up Webpack, and then they don't even have to understand the commands or any of the tags, because if you set up within the scripts tags of that package JSON file, you can just say, all right, every time that you pull down new code, you just run this command, it's going to compile things, and then you're off to the races there.
That'll make it easier for junior developers.
Yep, definitely. Set them up for success.
Would you commit your compiled files, or do you do that with production, like on servers?
I've done both. For our big application, what we typically do is we have build automation tools that every time we commit to master or a production branch, that it goes, and so we don't have our distribution folder included, but it'll go and run the npm install or yarn install, and then compile everything down so that it has a new fresh instance on there. But there's definitely cases where if it's just a single website, there's typically not a problem committing those dist files or the compiled files as well. One thing that does kind of complicate it a little bit is with your Git commits, if you have multiple people working in the same organization and they're merging things, and there's people that worked on the same file, sometimes it gets a little wonky and you have to kind of choose, or within that merge, you'll have to go back, pull the source files, and commit that again, just with merging GitHub or the Git branches as well. Anyone else? All righty. Thank you.